Alright, hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be talking about strategic second speaker arguments. I intended to make this lecture specifically on world schools and 3v3, but eventually, as I continued revising this lecture, I'm also perfectly fine um, reconceptualizing a lot of these lessons in British parliamentary because what I want to teach as the bottom line of this lecture is that the second speaker, as a role, ever since time immemorial, has always been the most least understood role, which is that there is a lot of you know expectations on what they need to do, but it's very difficult to see it in action because many rounds always differ, and the way the first speaker strategy has changed throughout time also changes the way the second speaker strategy has changed throughout time. And I'll be very explicit. Many years ago, um, there was this norm where the first speaker would cover the basics and the fundamentals of the case, and then they would have a team split where the second speaker would run some arguments that are somewhat supplementary but not necessary to the debate, and they would try and evolve it and then explain that as like a new thing, but it wasn't always like integral to the case. I would think that like a lot of second speaker arguments were you know trying to have small evolutions of existing material, or try to just run an argument for the sake of running an argument. And a lot of the time that worked back then, because when a case was comprehensive enough, then that was usually enough to win lots of rounds. I think second speaking has changed a lot over the years, particularly because of the new meta of front loading, where first speakers emphasize a lot of framing, a lot of characterization, a lot of detailed mechanism dependent analysis. And so, in essence, we see a lot of spamming. We see a lot of material brought out at first speaker to try and argue as much as possible. And so, what I wanted to tackle in this lecture is the question of, well, given that the meta across all first speakers and in debates like the ones that we see today are so overwhelming that in 7 minutes they pack so much, and you as a second speaker, you already have very little to work with because you already gave as much as you could to the first speaker. And now you are also having to deal with another first speaker of another team that is trying to like bring down hell onto you as well. The question is, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to adjust? And so, we take a step back. Let's try and unpack what we need to do to win. And I'll try and help parse through specific scenarios and examples that have been helpful for me when I was, specializing in being a second speaker. And also, how that ties in with the strategy that you want to implement as a team. So, of course, this is based on my experience, and that might be, good to know. All right. So, the objectives of this lecture are as follows. The first is to know what kind of second speaker that you have to be for different scenarios. Part of being a very good second speaker is that you need to be good at anticipating the problems that might arise. And you also have to be good at listening at what are the actual problems that have, transpired in a particular round. So it's a mix of both. You anticipate, you think about what are potential problems, and you want to try and think about ways you could address this. And then you also think about the actual analysis that they provided. You listen, you look at what they have said, right? What is the extent to how they have argued the argument? And then you make your response according to that so that you don't have to overwork yourself, right? Usually, when I was a second speaker before, I tried to just, do the same thing the first speaker does. I do everything. I try and like, preempt all other possible arguments. I try and like, address everything the other speaker was trying to do, and like I build millions of responses, but that's not gonna work because a lot will just get diluted and drowned out. Whereas if you were already anticipating the right thing, and if you were already honing down on the way in which it manifested in the previous speaker, then you're more likely to just win, against that team. And you will more likely win the debate because you've already beat one hurdle. The second thing I want to talk about is about building new material in a way that directly leverages your first speaker's speech. So, part of being a good second speaker is that you don't want to echo everything that your first speaker says. Because, there are parts of the case that will be under leveraged by virtue of them trying to be as comprehensive as possible. And there are parts where you know that the other team is trying to engage in a deadlock with, which your first speaker did not necessarily emphasize so much. And so now you have the opportunity to evolve that particular part of the case. So you got to think about what entry point you might have to build new material. So it's not so different from being an extension speaker, but an extension speaker always thinks about, well, how can I beat opening to be like more nuanced, more comprehensive, to talk about a different impact, a different weighing or whatever, and evolve that. But for a second speaker, you do it in a way that says, my first speaker was already so good, and what does this really mean for the debate? You know what I mean? Like, you want to be very, very intentional in the way that you are supporting the first speaker. That you're making their analysis that already existed work even better. So you're not a whip, because you're a whip will always try and weigh that, explain it in the round, and use that as a response. But now you have an opportunity to really just do some building, like mechanisms, impacts, new stuff, right? And that is always based on some of the short-term contingencies and short-term assumptions that your first speaker might already have provided, Third, you always want to try and impact and weigh your argument in a way that makes it easier for your third speech. So, of course, I made this lecture for World Schools and for Asian Parliamentary, but think of it like this. In a second speech, in opening half, what you're essentially doing is, once you have finished your first 3 minutes, or 3 minutes and 30 seconds, or 4 minutes, worst case, especially if you're bad at time management, 4 minutes is like the maximum you should be doing, especially if you've done some integrated responses with some building along the way. At the end of your portion of amassing constructive material, you want to summarize the case as the second speaker and say, what have we done at the end of the opening half? Why is our stuff winning until the very end? Why should you consider us winning? So that's what you're doing as a second speaker. So these are many aspects that make it, and this is my opinion, second speaking is on one end, it's the easiest position you can do, but it's also the most difficult because, you got to be a closer, but you also got to be very, very, very careful, very, very, very comprehensive. You got to, pick up your own work, and you have to shine on your own, right? You are not supposed to live and die with the first speaker, even though that's what the impression of it all might be. You have to also find a way to revive what exists, defend what exists, thrive in what is dying, and try to work with what you have. All right, let's get right into it, guys. So, an effective second speaker must do the following. So, this lecture, by the way, is structured in a few parts. The first part is what an effective second speaker must do. The second part is when you are practicing second speaker speeches, what you should be prepared to do. And the last part will be some strategies that don't help, and then some techniques that usually might work. So I'll relatively go through this a little bit fast because I've written it all out, but I'm going to explain it along the way, what the intuition is behind each and every part, no? So for the first part, what should an effective second speaker do? So they should do three things. The first is to prioritize what the team needs. The second is to evolve the case of the first speaker. And the third is to respond to the most dangerous contention. So let's get right into the first one. So you have to prioritize what the team needs. So how do you know what the team needs? Well, that will depend. Knowing what the team needs will always require an explanation of, what are the holes or the underemphasized parts of your first speaker. So this could be very obvious. For example, if your first speaker didn't get to do a particular weighing for their argument, then of course you gotta just do the weighing. But if it's not so obvious yet, like let's say they did complete their argument and they ran all the mechanisms, all the whatever that you needed to do that you prepared in the round, you can find out what the team needs based on specifically some parts that are really just vulnerable in the case, right? So that could be things that OO will directly engage with or OP will directly engage with, like an assumption in the case that it might not have been proven, but maybe in prep time you thought that both teams will agree in that in the debate, and now you gotta prove that in the debate, so you should do that. But it could also be something that is just inherent in the way that you have built the argument. So the example here is, in this house would allow corporations to run cities. If your first speaker focused primarily on why it is justified to trade off democracy for economic development, and it gets contested by LO on the effectiveness of corporations in running a city, then this is what you need to understand. When LO ran effectiveness of corporations in running a city, then they are necessarily explaining that corporations are just unproductive and that you don't reach your benefit. So the principle is not, you don't need to support that too much, right? Of course it might be contested, but right now that's not what your team needs. You could give all the other intuitions as to why democracy is not as important and that economic development is more important. You could do all the weighing about that, like it helps numbers of individuals, it helps future generations and whatever. But if you don't prove that the corporation actually does relatively promote economic development, then you're just not going to win on the principle alone. Which is why, that's what judges usually mean when they say that the principle just didn't help too much because it was contingent on certain assumptions. And here, it's kind of self-imposed, right? The self-imposition is that democracy is as important than economic development. That's still good for you to do at first speaker. I'm not saying that the first speaker was bad, right? It's a very good principle because OO could have definitely went into the round and went in and said that, we'll concede that they have economic development, but it's not that important because we believe that individuals have a right to be able to vote in for their leaders and promote the policies that they themselves have preferences for. And that could become a very, very good argument on inequality, by the way, which is why they might say, even if there's economic development, then your corporation and the way you develop the economy will lead to more mass inequality, which is why democracy is very important because it gets the vast number of working class individuals that would likely vote for policies that will resist against economic development and promote more social reforms that are better for all people. So I'm just giving the very, very, very good opposition case here on the principle, right? And how that is tied with the inequality argument. And but that is why you might have run the argument on trading off democracy for economic development, right? But of course you couldn't predict what the LO would specifically double down on. And so now as a second speaker, you should be like, okay, now I'm gonna focus on this. I just gotta prove that corporations are effective, So that makes the case comprehensive, right? So even if they will eventually, and this is where I get a little bit advanced here, right? Even if another team might eventually talk about inequality, you're still able to adjust, right? You're still able to explain that corporations promote economic development in a way that will be equalizing or give more money to the government that could give that distribution to more people. And then you could say that governments fail at doing those same policies that you assume opposition should support, right? So don't be too worried, right? Don't be too worried yet. You just prioritize what the team needs. Right now, intuitively, the most important need is effectiveness of corporations. Number 2, you have to evolve the case of the first speaker. So there are many examples in this particular lecture on evolution, so I'll go through this one very quickly. In the motion, this House regrets the glorification of soldiers as heroes. If your first speaker focused on how glorification impedes the pursuit of justice for war crimes, right? So notice that that is the argument. The argument is it will stop justice for war crimes, accountability, right? Then that argument already has some schema and characterization of how glorification manifests, right? Glorification manifests in a way that is likely going to impede justice. And then that is part of what the argument is. But it's not only that, right? Now you have to think, what are the evolution points based on this argument? Is it based on the way I will impact the argument? Is it the way that I am going to weigh the argument? Or is it the way that I am going to explain glorification? Now, this might be a bit difficult to grasp now, but what I want you guys to understand is it's not really about choosing one thing, because when you choose one thing, it will always affect the other things anyways. When you evolve a certain mechanism, you're also changing the way that you will explain the impact. When you change the context and characterization, you are also changing the way that you will explain the argument as well. And so here, if your first speaker focused on how glorification impedes justice for past criminals, then you can potentially expound on how glorification interacts with the decisions to go to war to begin with. And then you can subsequently impact this with respect to the manipulation of the public interest, the coercive forces behind conscription, etc. So notice that the mechanism is very tied with the way in which the impact manifests because you've evolved it from the first argument, right? So the first argument already talks about justice, right? But it's not about justice for past crimes. It's also about justice for potential future victims. And we will explain that glorification allowed individuals to go to war and disenfranchise many communities because of the conditions of that glorification, which involved the following mechanisms. You manipulated the public through propaganda. You encouraged more individuals who were very, very war hungry to join conscription and join war for the sake of national sovereignty and protection of the nation. And then those things, right? This is quite interesting. This way of arguing about going to war will actually evolve the first argument. Because now you say it's not about only past war crimes, but it actively enables war crimes to actively happen today. Because now there's a veil of protection, of glorification that is provided to many soldiers that are engaged in war. So that's why, like, the first speaker didn't need to talk about all those other things like future war and all the crimes that are committed. But the second speaker has a great opportunity to now evolve the argument in that specific way. If that might be strategic, right? I don't know if this is strategic yet. I'm just showing one potential way to evolve it. The third thing that the second speaker does is to respond to the most dangerous contention. So for example, if the motion was, this house regrets organized religion, this is where you can, learn the balance between anticipation and actually identifying what the dangerous contention is. Because, of course, this is what I want you to understand. When it's so early in the debate, sometimes it's very clear that some deadlocks are very difficult to resolve. And sometimes it's clear that some parts of your argument will get attacked more than others. And those are the things that usually the judge will be very, very, very cognizant of. They usually track this immediately and they really write this down. That's why it is the most dangerous contention. Because the judge will only likely be persuaded more to remember your case and remember your team if you are able to overcome these initial dangerous barriers, right? So usually, sometimes people end up, trying to mistake and misinterpret how the round went. Like, they just think it's a debate about intuition. But usually the only reason why judges end up trying to credit other things that you might not think you have prioritized too much is usually because it's like a domino effect. If you don't focus on the most dangerous thing, then it becomes easier for the judge to credit all the other things from the other side. And then it becomes harder and harder for them to credit maybe all the other good things that you might have emphasized a lot. So that's why you have to definitely engage with the most dangerous thing. Otherwise, you're kind of, giving up a lot of ground. So in this motion, if your first speaker focused on developing the reasons why organized religion is difficult to contest, and these are the usual structural reasons people usually provide, which is authority, doctrine, tradition, within the community, and socialization, which is among individuals to create echo chambers. And then LO proceeds to explain that organized religion gives relatively more power for groups to gradually improve the interpretation of doctrine, as opposed to personal religion, which can lead to more polarization. This is what I want you to understand. You would need to break down the underlying assumptions of this contention before you do anything else. Because what have they done? LO provides an implicit true comparative, which is they say that no, you have to compare it between organized religion and personal religion. Personal religion is actually more polarizing. There's less empathy. There's less interaction, less understanding. But organized religion, according to LO, and what they're doing is they're trying to spin all these structural reasons. They say that doctrine allows people to improve the interpretation of religion so that that religion is more popular among newer generations, which is very valid, right? That's how doctrine evolves and how it becomes relatively more accommodating of different interests. So what you need to understand is you can't just respond to the argument wholesale. Like you're going to say, well, here are the reasons why doctrine is necessarily always going to be very, 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 very traditionalist and very, very conservative and then very, very bad. Nor can you just say that, oh, here are the reasons why polarization is better, is resolved better in our side with personal religion. You can't just say one part. You have to try and break it down altogether when you're responding. So this is what I would do. I would go in and say that leader of opposition makes a fundamental mistake in this debate. The first is that they assume that personal religion on their side is one in which will be more polarizing, and that is why it is necessary to have organized religion. When really, the underlying beliefs that individuals have are informed by many other moral systems around them, like their experiences with other people, their experiences with other communities, and other secular interpretations. So there is already evolution of social progress. But the problem is, organized religion, as a consequence of the very same mechanisms the previous speaker talks about, they impede the pursuit of accessing those other forms of morality, and they regress more and more. So this is why I think it's a very advanced, very good response, because now you say, and you're directly breaking apart the argument, the mechanism of doctrine leads to more regression more than it leads to more evolution. And we have proven the comparative that organized religion crowds out other semblances of promoting empathy and understanding between religious institutions and other communities. Sorry, I just realized that it wasn't clearly seen on the screen, but you can read it now. That should be good. So, yeah, responding to the most dangerous contention is very, very, very integral and very, very important in a circumstance like this. Having said that, when you are practicing second speaker speeches, and this is where I'm going on to a self-development tangent. It's very difficult to prepare second speeches. It's very easy to prepare for first speeches because you could just do PM speeches all you want, all day, right? You just get a motion, do a PM speech, whatever. But it's very difficult to do a second speech because you're expected to, engage with the round and listen a lot more because you're the first response, technically, especially if you're a DPM or second speaker in proposition. And so now what I want to unpack, or what I want to break as an assumption, is that a second speaker always has to be completely flexible. Like, they gotta be like completely fluid. Like, they go into a round with nothing written on their paper completely, and then they just start writing only when the previous speaker starts talking, right? Not really, because you're really wasting a lot of time. Like, you're wasting a lot of opportunities to anticipate, to think about what the round would look like, to try and think about ways in which you could build your argument and all that stuff. And so when you are in the position of thinking as a second speaker, it changes the way that you prep. And I think this is very important, right? You will change the way that you think when you are in prep time. You are really actively thinking ahead. And this is what I encourage in many students. The first is, you have to learn to experiment with building within your responses. And the eventual endpoint of this lesson is that you have to learn to be explicit in guiding the judge to acknowledge that you are also building within your response. So I'll give a very good example here. In the motion, this house regrets the emphasis of grades in Asian societies. And if your first speaker explains that an emphasis on grades puts significant pressure on students and it sets them up for failure, and then leader of op argues that absent an emphasis on grades, students will still likely be pressured by their parents for a variety of other reasons, then you now, and this is what I want you to understand, now, because LO was so neutralizing, right? They're so neutralizing. They're saying that things are all symmetric, that there's a pressure no matter what, and all that stuff. Now you have an opportunity to build a counterfactual, because they were begging the question anyways, right? And they were challenging you to build the counterfactual. So now, when you are responding to LO, you should build the counterfactual a lot more. This is what I would say. LO argues that the pressure is symmetric, but they misunderstand that the emphasis on grades is very different. It is a uniquely toxic form of pressure, and this is where I go into building mode, right? Because it involves high pressure testing environments and individualized scoring, which will lead to more unhealthy social comparisons and a lack of internal tracking of growth. Furthermore, what this proves is that an emphasis on grades crowds out other meaningful metrics of progress, such as being involved in extracurricular, being involved in community work, or being involved on social involvement in trade activities, which are relatively more subjective and more difficult things to grade and compare against other individuals. This is the likely counterfactual because schools still have an incentive to demonstrate graduation by fulfilling minimum requirements on previously graded activities and then subsequently expanding the range of activities that they offer for students. Because I would argue, and this is where I'm trying to build the counterfactual, colleges and other societies will always think and look at all the other holistic metrics anyways. But grades is almost always a very small portion of that. So it's wrong for Asian societies to emphasize grades so much in this particular way that we explained in the response and the building within that response. So I kind of like this because now we have made it so clear that this is what the counterfactual is. Their problem assumes that parents will always be mean and be very pressuring regardless. But this pressure on grades is so different than anything else. And then you could build this a lot more. You could say that many children, many kids want to, have novelty, do many other things, right? They just don't want to do studying math 24/7. They also want to do like violin. They also want to do their other hobbies. They want to go into leadership positions. They want to run for student council. So these things, we cultivate that genuine curiosity and genuine excitement in students. So even if there is still some pressure to get very good at doing the things they are very passionate about, we're okay with that because it is a relatively more workable pressure that many students can deal with. So do you notice that just from this one response, right, against the argument on students will likely still be pressured by parents regardless, I have created an entire new realm of analysis that otherwise would not have existed. And that's why I think it's kind of nice. It's very, very, very specific with respect to the way it manifests. The second way to try and improve as a second speaker is to choose an appropriate mix of aggressive and charitable responses. So the example here is this house believes that military leaders should be directly elected by citizens. If you are the DLO, and the debate so far has been a deadlock on whether military appointed leaders are more war hungry than military leaders with a political mandate, which is a very, very precise comparison, mind you. It's a very, very, like, I wouldn't say it's too advanced, but it's quite complex, right? Like, they're saying that there is a difference between military leaders that are appointed than military leaders that are elected because they campaign for that position. So now, if you're opposition, right, you're DLO, and everyone is contesting this, like the marginal difference between being appointed and being elected, there are many ways in which you could respond. But I don't want you to get caught up in this goo goo gaga, right? Like always trying to prove all this mutual exclusive stuff, right? And then going over and over and over back on this deadlock, right? You need to be more charitable, but also still maintain some level of aggression. Why? Because if you are too charitable, then you kind of drop a lot of stuff your first speaker does. If you are too aggressive, you're too assertive and you don't expand your win condition. And so this is what you can do. And this is the best way I would do it. You can, A, explain that it's very unlikely that military leaders will differentiate from the political line of their party. B, explain that the risk of a war-hungry military leader is less important compared to other considerations in the debate, like political polarization during an election. Or C, you could explain that the public are misguided and an electoral campaign will be unproductive. So notice that all these other responses or response strategies, right, they involve some level of differentiation on the assumptions you are accepting. For example, right, when you say that the public are misguided, right, that's an assumption that you are accepting. If you're responding in that way, you're saying that the public are misguided, the electoral campaign will be unproductive, which is why you are likely going to have military leaders that are elected on a very populist, war-hungry agenda. Just because you've explained why the public is dumb. But notice how that's different from like the second one, right? They say that like a war-hungry military leader, right? You have accepted the assumption that the military leader is likely going to be more war-hungry, right? So now you're going to say that that's very different than what we will say in opposition, which is, you know, as long as the military leader is appointed, loyalty is the most important thing in the debate. And that's what we will defend until the very end. So notice that those two assumptions, letter B and letter C, they require some level of massaging the assumptions before you run the response. And so you can't just choose one. You gotta try and find a way to layer it. So that's why it's almost always better for you to prioritize a layered response and then package it within some even if argumentation. So for example, I would say this. I would say, number one, this is an untrue comparative. It is not a debate on whether or not military appointed leaders or those that are elected are more war hungry or not. There are many ways in which elections can produce less war hungry leaders. This is why that's not the most important thing. But number two, even if this were the comparative, a unified response is almost always better for a unified military and government response during war. So notice that first I say, not the comparative, untrue. But lastly, I'm going to say, you know what? Let's assume that it is true. This is why loyalty and political polarization are the most important considerations in this round for the effectiveness of military operations. And then you move on from there. So the point is, you got to be comprehensive. You at least have to try to be a little bit more massaging of certain assumptions so that you are able to have a direct point of comparison against the direct team against you And you can't just allow the closing to just be like, we're gonna bite the bullet and do this and try and engage with OG more directly because OO skirts their burden. You know what I mean? Um, the last strategy then would be to significantly adjust the argument that you might have prepared in prep time. And this is usually the worst case. And it happens more often than you think, even in very high level rooms. Which is to say that when we think about adjusting an extension, right? If you're closing half and you're thinking about how can I adjust my argument that I prepared in prep time in a way that directly engages with the opening half deadlocks or the existing arguments that were presented in the round, how can we weigh this to be the most important thing? Notice that that is your option, right? You could do that, right? You always think about adjusting in that way. But when you're a second speaker, you have less time. You just cannot. You cannot have the liberty to go and like write out everything. So when you run an argument, you can't just run like a random argument and then just like expect that it's going to be brilliant and then you work out. Like that's what you might think that you need to do at closing, for example. But here, you got to be solid. You got to try to help your first speaker win. And you can't just like go rogue and run a new argument. So, but I don't also want you to abandon very nice arguments because those nice arguments could be framed in a way that engages with the existing debate. So, for example, in the demonization of colonization in post-colonial states, having done more harm than good, if you had an interesting idea in mind to explain that the demonization undermines democratic systems because it pushes post-colonial states away from the cooperation with their democratic former colonizers, that's an insanely good argument, by the way, because it talks about globalization. It talks about how a government becoming more and more isolationist as a consequence of the anger against former colonizers will lead to them becoming more authoritarian and thereby becoming more dictatorial, etc., etc. Notice that that could be a good argument, but if PM and LO is still caught up in whether demonization is productive in creating unity in the transition to stable governance, right? They talk about whether or not, demonization is likely going to like unify different ethnicities or it's gonna, promote like those ethnicities that were already taken, like those elite groups that were already promoted by the previous colonial regime. And then you talk about political dynasties, you talk about all those other things. So that could be possible if you talk about that with respect to violence and unity and whatever. But if that was the way in which they argued it, like purely domestic, right? Domestic and the engagements within that state and the divisions that exist in polarizing ways, now you need to adjust your argument to focus on the more unity-related impacts as opposed to the globalization, trade, and democracy dynamics. So instead of going in the argument and saying, we are going to prove why we have globalization and, more trade. And then I'm going to argue trade is the most important thing because there's economic development. You redistribute it to different populations. You allow businesses to thrive. You have more foreign investment. I could do that all I want, but like I'm already starting in like the wrong foot because I'm not trying to engage at all with the unity argument on, the violence, ethnicities, political polarization that opening half talks about. So how do I allow that to come to fruition without abandoning the argument entirely? I would say that when a government demonizes the former colonizer, what is likely going to happen? They are likely going to impose significant foreign restrictions. They will likely campaign on significant imperial nationalist policies and have political parties from the nationalist government that is promoted more than not. And they will likely use propaganda in a way to amplify this anger more and more. Opening half just talks about, or sorry, not opening half. Like the first speaker in this debate has a deadlock on, whether this has more unity and whether this promotes more violence or not. But I want to explain that it's not only just that, but that when you create a social conditioning of anger, then you do not know when to stop being angry from the former colonizers, and this is likely going to affect a wide array of governments around the world that may want to engage in good faith with global trade with the country. And that is where you end up having oligarchic competition that is promoted by the government and administration. You have crony capitalism, you have authoritarian governments trying to continuously suppress media from foreign competitors or domestically to try and continue justify having this angry position. And that is where the government loses more and more money to invest on government institutions and social welfare that are integral to economic redistribution or the ability of them to, democratize in the future. Now notice that the way the argument eventually turned out is still exactly how I initially envisioned it, but the way that the argument is positioned with respect to existing material and existing responses is always with respect to how do I talk about the unity stuff first? How do I talk about, how do I introduce my mechanism from starting on the unity impact in the beginning? That's why it's like you adjust the argument in that way rather than starting with economic development. So now I want to move on to some strategies that don't necessarily help at second speaker. Now, these strategies, they seem to be very helpful in the moment because they're very easy to implement. But usually when it is done in a very excessive degree, which is what you might see a lot, it doesn't always work. Number one, it might include neutralizing or washing too much. Like saying that, oh no, here are 3 reasons why something is symmetric. There's no impact on either side. We're going to look at this one impact until the very end. That doesn't always help out because a closing team could always try and reopen that package and say that, you know what, it's not really symmetric. There might be a little bit bigger change. And so just on the bigger change, because you've narrowed down your benefit and winning to one single thing, you actually weaken a lot of your winning chances. I'm not saying that neutralizing is always bad. Actually, neutralizing can be very, very effective, especially in very broad debates. But when you do it too much, you really weaken the conclusions that you yourself might purportedly try and promote. Especially when you have long-standing, wide-standing criticisms against the other team. Number 2, you can push back with your first speaker's frame too aggressively. You could say that this is the only clash in the round, so you shouldn't consider any argument on reparations, no argument on economic development, no argument on anything. We just want to talk about inequality and move on from there. So the mere fact that you are only engaging in one issue is already very problematic, even if you win that issue, by the way. And actually, usually, if you've already focused so much time on it, you might actually already be winning it, right? It's either you're already winning it or like it's just a lost cause and you should just focus on something else. So almost always, don't be too aggressive in defending one single thing. And the third thing is you might end up biting in too much to the frame of the other team. Like, for example, on this house, the institution of marriage is incompatible with feminism. You might go in and say, well, if LO argues that this debate is only about feminism as choice feminism, and then they say that the debate is only about whether marriage promotes choice or not, then it's not always in your interest to accept this outright. Like, you can't just go in as DPM and say, you know what, this is going to be about choice feminism. I'm going to give the reasons as to why we specifically promote more choice at Gov when you don't have the institution of marriage, right? And then it's a debate about like, oh, how does marriage promote choice? But that's very limiting because you know that they chose that issue because it's relatively advantageous for them. Or at least initially, it's very easy for them to run that argument on choice feminism as the framing for their argument because they're gonna make all the other examples, all the other building parts dependent on, or at least connected to, very deeply connected and integrated with the explanation on how marriage specifically promotes choice. Like, for example, like, tax divisions or inheritance or property laws or all that other stuff. But now, if you even take a step back, right? Don't bite into the frame immediately. You could say the institution of marriage crowds out other segments of the feminist movement and it promotes inequality even if some people benefit from marriage. Then that would be a certainly important and different impact in the round. Why do I say this? It's because if you're able to unpack the assumption of OO, which is choice feminism is important because I was in control of my money, in control of my life, and all that other stuff. All you need to demonstrate at Gov is not that choice is unimportant, but you want to say that being part of the feminist movement means that you want to be able to be free from pressure to choose many other relationships, many other potential identities that you otherwise want. And marriage ties you into this relationship for your entire life, financially, economically, socially. Here are the ways in which you are specifically tied in. And that is why it is restricting of choice. But it's not only that, it is that most of these individuals, right, they might benefit from marriage, but they have to abandon a lot of other ideals that could have also provided them with a lot more happiness and a lot more individuality, like being a career woman or focusing on your family and all other social obligations. Like maybe they want to opt out of romance entirely or whatever, right? So I'm not saying that you want to shift the impact alone, right? Notice that you are specifically trying to unpack the assumption of OO, why choice feminism is important, and then use that in a way that explains that the institution of marriage, by virtue of the specific mechanisms that I am providing now, directly privilege one group over others, and it creates more inequality. So now it's like, yeah, you know what? This is very, very, very good in understanding the dynamics of, oh, what concessions am I willing to make? What argument am I willing to make? And then you move on from there. Game. Let's continue. So now, to end this presentation, I'm going to give 3 worked examples on scenarios, right? They're very difficult scenarios, and I'll just show how it usually manifests in a second speaker speech, and then you guys could review that on your own time, because I think the biggest portion that I can contribute in this part of the lecture is just help you understand what's actually going on. So first, one technique would be to extend on specific mechanisms. Again, if you've watched my other videos, a mechanism is just any logical pathway. But a mechanism could manifest in many things, right? Especially in the first speaker, where they're rushing through mechanisms, where it feels like a lot get underappreciated and it just gets asserted, and maybe it might not be well proven, and maybe the other team might not listen to it and might not respond. And if they don't respond to it and they don't listen to it, you gotta be a little bit worried somewhat, because maybe the judges are also not listening to the mechanisms of your first speaker as well. And so now maybe you gotta like build it a little bit more. So notice like this example, right? I like this example a lot. In the motion, this House supports the use of economic sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. Your PM explains that economic sanctions are a good compromise to incentivize authoritarian countries to go to the negotiating table. Because economic sanctions, and these are the mechanisms you're providing, again, logical pathways. Number 1, they potentially cause civil distress, which is why they have a self-interest to negotiate. Number 2, they undermine the financing of the authoritarian country, which is why they would want to negotiate. And number 3, they are better than the more devastating alternatives, such as military intervention, which is why they would like to negotiate. So, LO goes in, and they provide a series of reasons that say that economic sanctions harm civilians more than they cause reform to the existing administration, and that authoritarian leaders will do as much as possible to stay in power so that they will never ever change. In fact, you push them farther away from the international community because they will retaliate. This is a very good argument, I think, because OO has done the expected argument on why economic sanctions harm civilians, but they go a little bit further. They say that, you know what, you actually push them farther from the international community, because now they will want to retaliate and they will want to stay in power for as long as possible. And of course, they could do the usual extensions of this. They could say they turn to other regional trading agreements, they go to other rogue states and they coordinate with them, or dictatorships will cooperate with one another, etc., etc. But now you don't want to get caught away with just saying that OP just talked about why sanctions harm civilians. Our argument was preempting this, and we talked about why they will want to negotiate even before it harms the civilians, and that is why it's going to be very, very good. The threat of sanctions are effective. I agree that's a very good response, by the way, but I don't think it's the most effective response, because you're not really directly flipping the analysis. This is what I think works a little bit better. OP assumes that authoritarian leaders want to stay in power, so much so to the point that they will turn away from the international community. When this is simply unresponsive to my first speaker's explanation on the overriding incentive of an authoritarian leader to get financing from international institutions to improve their legitimacy. So now, I got the opportunity to explain what are the international institutions that help improve the legitimacy that are very, very vital for an authoritarian leader to stay in power. I would say this means that the threat of economic sanctions undermines their source of legitimacy, which is their ability to distribute social welfare, to enter into favorable trading arrangements with their own businesses, and to have more loans to use for their own development projects. You cannot get that outside of the international community, which is more globalized, more integrated, and they have cheaper and cheaper goods and cheaper businesses, more freer travel restrictions among these countries, so much so that not being part of an international trading arrangement actually directly is an opportunity cost for many authoritarian leaders that leads to more distrust against them. So now, financing from an international community, right? Loans, being seen as legitimate, having more votes in these parties uniquely helps them stay in power, so they will cooperate. So OO is simply wrong in terms of the likelihood of them turning to other unstable actors or other leaders that might not relatively provide them with the same degree of financing. I kind of love this because it's very, very clear that they will negotiate, that it is a positive incentive. You are building the comparative, but at the same time, you're debunking the other claim. I'll go through these last two examples a little bit quickly. The second technique is going hardline. I encourage a lot of people to do this all the time because you get to learn more about what responses you could otherwise run. So in this motion, this House would allow police officers to refuse orders on the grounds of conscience. You run into the LO argument that this will cause more disunity within the police force. It's a very obvious argument, and such will reduce the effectiveness of police operations, which will, again, and they make another consequent impact from this. It leads to more distrust, more crime, and then more crime is bad. And then they weigh that however they want. So notice it's a very superficial argument, but it's still a very dangerous argument, right? Because you want to acknowledge that you can't just break the chain of logic. You have to also address, well, what is really going to happen? Like, what is the realistic impact? And so, sometimes being too aggressive and saying that, no, it's not going to be disunity. It's going to be unity among all police against their superiors. And then that's the only degree to which you debate the debate. That's kind of very, very, very arrogant, in my opinion. Because OO could even evolve their argument into saying that it causes more disunity among police officers with each other, so that now there's no expectation that that policeman beside me is going to defend me, because now they're going to refuse orders and they won't help the team. So now I'm going to be more discriminatory and I'm going to use even more violence as a police officer because I will only defend myself. So now notice that that's a potential way OO could improve their argument. Now you want to hedge off against that risk. Even if disunity happens, this will likely happen under circumstances where disenfranchised minority groups within the police force have tensions with other police officers. So now I have significantly clarified the context in favor of my argument. And then I would even go further. I would say, in fact, this disunity is good so that more people are made to check their privilege, and that these groups can collectivize to assert their relative leverage in the police operation. So, and this is where I go even further with the even if police operations are less effective, it's an essential check and balance against many groupthink-driven operations that can disenfranchise minority communities. I kind of like this because notice this last part kind of like emphasizes your teammate a lot more, no? Because definitely your first speaker already argued why police officers might end up ordering very, very bad things like, promoting warrior policing and all those other things. But now you want to say that even disunity within the police force is a significant contributor to accountability. So now you've evolved the argument of your first speaker. The last technique is comprehensive weighing. So what I mean by comprehensive weighing is kind of similar to the video that I made on integrated weighing. But this is just you want to deal with multiple different like weighing mechanisms. I say weighing mechanism because it's a weighing logical pathway within the argument and trying to win on different grounds, different ways to win. So for example, what I want you to understand is I will tie as many impacts as possible to multiple weighing metrics in a round. So think of it like a web. One impact could help you win with one weighing pathway, but one impact could win on multiple winning pathways, right? Different ways to weigh that argument in the round. So for example, in the motion, this house regrets the premium placed on forgiveness as a virtue, what are the ways in which you could weigh certain arguments in this round? You could weigh them with respect to the issue on interpersonal forgiveness. You could weigh with respect to national unity after conflict. You could weigh this with respect to integrity of the criminal justice system. And of course, there might be sub-weighings within this, right? Like interpersonal forgiveness is important for maybe social unity, which could contribute to the second thing. Or integrity of the criminal justice system could be about like future victims or, trust and financing for legal cases, for example, to help current victims. So let's try and look at one impact that might be in the debate, and then we try and find ways in which it is winning. So this is why, as a second speaker, you're helping the judge discover many different ways that my existing material already explicitly beats out other potential ways closing could try and win the debate on different aspects, right? Because maybe one team might double down on one thing, but you want to already show we have a lot of preemptive ground to try and weigh against many other potential arguments. So this is what I would do. I would say one impact, without the premium on forgiveness, we are simply going to be more objective in evaluating and assessing the harm caused by perpetrators, because prioritizing forgiveness also deprioritizes the weight of victims' feelings. So note that that's the argument. It's a comparative argument. The comparative is we are going to be more objective without a premium placed on forgiveness. And so now I want to explain what does objectivity mean with respect to the round. So this just assumes that the argument works, that you've actually proven that we will have more objective justice systems. So now I'm tying it to different weighing metrics of the round. Objectivity means the following, which is why we win the debate. Number one, we become less fixated on exaggerating the evils or irredeemable character of perpetrators, which is why this is necessarily important for our ability to have a better social empathy for these individuals that were disenfranchised by their own states, helping criminals that were unduly put into prison. Number two, we provide greater chances towards future reconciliation and rehabilitation, which contributes to reducing crime in the long run. And that is why it is necessarily important that we focus on a more rehabilitative justice system. And number three, we become more socially accepting of mistakes, increasing participation in the justice system, which means that now people are more willing to go to testimony, to go and report, to go and not go for a plea bargain. So now there is more trust in the justice system because we are relatively more objective on the facts of the matter. So notice that all of this stuff, by the way, they're just like impacts that become tied to weighing metrics. So that's why I don't think of it as like, oh, it's just one impact, many weighing metrics. But you always want to think of it as, how does the way I will weigh the argument? How does the way that I will explain the importance of my argument change the specific impacting of that argument as well? So if you're talking about objectivity for future victims, then yeah, of course it's gonna be about like this. If you're gonna talk about objectivity for like social perception, then it's gonna be this, like letter A. But if you're gonna talk about like objectivity for like the legal support system and state support system, then this is what works, right? Letter C. So always a matter of reimagining different ways that your argument might potentially work in a particular round. Okay? So yeah, this is a very long lecture. So that's pretty much it. Again, guys, being a first speaker, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, very complex, very multi-layered. But hopefully this lecture doesn't intimidate you too much. Notice that as you accumulate more experiences, more dilemmas, more struggles, more potential roadblocks in, even deadlocks in debates, you become more experienced in dealing with the question of what does my team need? What do I have to do? How do I specifically promote my first speaker? And how do I respond a little bit more efficiently? Right? All of these strategies are always geared with the intent, the goal of trying to, you know, maximize your chances of winning given the problems that are existent in a round. And that's all you can hope for as a second speaker, right? In the same way that a first speaker deals with uncertainty, and maybe that is why they end up spamming a lot, the second speaker deals with some information, but still an entire new realm of mystery of how the debate might turn out. And so that's why always thinking, being more intentional about your strategy makes it a little bit easier to improve later on. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.